next.
Today's show may change everything you think you know about the most important subject of all. What happens when you die? You're going to meet people who actually have died, clinically flatlined, then miraculously came back to life. They believe they have been to the other side, and the stories they have brought back will amaze you, confound you, maybe even comfort you. We call these near-death experiences. Now, many doctors don't believe in them, but as a surgeon, I've seen it from both sides. And what I have learned from my own patients has changed everything I believe about life and death. Imagine you're in a devastating accident or suffer sudden cardiac arrest. Your life is on the brink. You have no pulse. You stop breathing. From the outside, looking in, you're dead. But inside, you don't feel dead at all. Your senses are on fire, but you're very calm, peaceful. You float up, out of your body, watching as rescuers work desperately to revive you. Fragments of your life flash by. You see a tunnel, a bright light, and loved ones long gone from Earth. We call it a near-death experience. And one study found it happens to nearly 800 people in this country every day. It has even happened to a patient of mine. My patients have always changed me, but few patients have changed me like George. George needed heart surgery. I didn't think he'd survive, but he convinced me to operate. During the surgery, George began hemorrhaging, and I could not get it to stop. And at the end of 3 days, and it's a miracle I will never forget, the bleeding stopped. Then I got called from the ICU that George was waiting for me. He doesn't say anything. He just nods his head confidently because he survived. And the next day, he said, "How long was I out?" I said, "About 3 days." He nodded his head, and he said, "I thought it was about that long." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I felt like I was in this deep, dark ether, this jelly, and I looked up and I could see this light, this bright light in my eyes, and I began to fall away from it like a bug on its back. I couldn't move my body that well, and the light was getting further and further, and I knew that if I lost sight of the light, I would die." And I was shocked, absolutely shocked. I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "I began to paddle as fast as I could, furiously with my hands, just trying to wade my way back into this light, trying to get close to it. I knew it was the source of my life. And I just had the sense that that's where I needed to be." I said, "Were you scared?" I said, "I wasn't scared. It was like I didn't have a choice. I was going to go to that light." And so finally, I got right under it, and I pushed myself up, and that's when I woke up. And he saw that light brought him back to this planet, to this existence, to this awareness. That convinced me that there's a life after death. What George Serafin taught me is that we don't do death well in America. And I have been hearing so many of these stories we're going to talk about today. And I finally figured out that there's something in the mystery of death that we can't ignore. And medicine is getting a lot closer to explaining what's going on. So I thought, let's just pull it together today and have this open discussion about a topic that so many of us are so fearful of, so confused by. But there's a difference between confusion and mystery. Now, what I want you all to hear firsthand are some of these accounts. Laura Lynn was living life to the fullest. She was on the fast track to becoming a professional tennis player. But everything changed when she underwent a very simple operation and then died during the surgery.
I had never had an operation before, but they reassured me it was 20 minutes. It was no big deal. But when the doctor went in, he punctured the abdominal aorta. I lost massive amounts of blood, and I was clinically dead. Next, I remember being up and off to the right. And I'm thinking, why am I up by the ceiling? Then I looked down, and that's when I saw my body. I could see in the room that there was a lot of red, and people were very upset about something. And I couldn't understand, looking down, what they were upset about. I wasn't fearful. I wasn't in pain. I just knew that everything was going to be okay. So I went up and out, and it was just expansive. It was just total blackness, the most comfortable, peaceful, quiet. There's a light on the horizon, and what I wanted to do the most was go into that light. It was a place of unconditional love. It was a place that I would never want to leave. And then I have this presence come in between and intercept me before I can get to this most beautiful, loving light. And it was my brother-in-law. He had died 7 months earlier from cancer. He wanted to take me on this journey that gave me a sense of really understanding life in a whole different way. We got around to talking about it's time to go back, and I go, well, I don't want to go back. And he said, well, there's been a mistake. You have to go back. You have to live your life's purpose. And at that, I was pulled back. Dropping back through darkness, I slammed into my body, and I was back.
So, Laurelyn, that is one heck of a first-hand account. So talk to me about how going to a place where 800 people a day go, this near-death experience, talk to me about how that changed your life.
Well, immediately when I came back, I was like a stranger in a strange land. I didn't really have the orientation anymore, and I just didn't understand why we were all running around in these crazy ways, trying to do things that didn't make sense, when I learned that it was really about people. It was about giving yourself with love and, you know, non-judgmentally looking at people and being with them. So.
And what's different about your life now? I mean, I understand that at a high level, but I mean, how do you apply it day to day?
Well, day to day, I live each day like it's your last. I mean, I don't always do that, but that's really my message, to live each day like it's your last.
Now, just hearing you talk about this, it's a very spiritual discussion. And,
yeah.
I struggled personally as I was thinking about this show, about how we're going to deal with religion and spirituality. So, I mean, is that the major way that it has affected you? Do you think of yourself as a more spiritual person now?
Definitely more spiritual, less religious.
Less religious.
But the good news is that, like all religions, it was very clear to me in that space that all religions work. It's all good. So.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Yes.
So Steve had his near-death experience after he was hospitalized for an asthma attack. You'll want to see this.
I had a massive asthma attack, and I was taken to hospital, and by the time I arrived there, I was in pulmonary arrest. So I was put into a medically induced coma, but the blockage was still so severe that the respirator was shut down. Someone contacted my family saying that someone should come pick up my body. When I was in this coma, the first thing I remember was everything was this light blue-gray in color. The only thing that was with me was a being beside me. I could feel its presence. It was a comforting presence, a reassuring presence, but it was also a presence of magnitude and power. I felt things were all right. And I began a review of my life. Key moments. But at the same time, I was re-experiencing it from the other people's points of view. And that was a stunner, because you feel their pain, you feel the sting, you feel the hurt. It was just this horrifying realization that I really was not the person that I thought I was. And at that point, the being sent me messages. It's all right. That's what humans do. Humans make mistakes. Now I could let all that go. I then found myself in the middle of space, surrounded by stars, galaxies, nebulae, and I felt like I was an integral part of the universe. Then I started seeing future events. I saw that my children would be needing me, and I really felt I needed to be back to help them. The next thing I can remember is waking up. It took me a week to get my brain settled so that I began to understand where I was and what had happened to me.
Wow. Wow. So what happened when you returned back to your body?
Well, I returned to a medical disaster, really. Something had happened during the coma. They never knew what it was. I came back to my body in excruciating pain, immense pain. I was paralyzed from the neck down, and I was told it was going to be permanent because there was massive damage to nerve fibers and nerve sheaths throughout my body.
Well, the medical story itself is miraculous to hear in its recovery. But what really caught my attention was this whole idea of a life review. The fact that you would go through an exam almost, and you didn't like what you saw with this life review. Talk to me about that.
No, it was really it was awful. I re-experienced these events from my point of view. It was just being there. He wasn't watching it. It was reliving it again. At the same time, I was experiencing it from the other people's points of view. I was them, reliving that experience. And at the same time, how this works, I can't tell you. I was experiencing it from a higher reality, the truth of the matter. And so what I saw was my lies, my self-deception to myself to convince me certain things are okay to do because people deserve it or they have it coming.
Right.
I was then experiencing those people's, the emotional impact that had on them, what they felt. I felt their pain. I felt the shock of it on them. Yeah. But then I also saw they have their own lies and self-deceptions.
Sure.
And so the net result was I felt like I was a failure as a person. I had not been the person I thought I was. It was humiliating. I felt really dreadful. And it was just, yeah, completely humbling. But and the judgment came from myself. It wasn't from an outside source. But then this being who was with me was sending me comforting messages, thank goodness. And one of them was, it's all right. You're only human.
Talk to me about, as you look now in some hindsight at this near-death experience, do you feel you were given a second chance at life? Is that an oversimplification?
No, that's exactly what it was. I was given a second chance at life. I had a chance now to change things so that the next time I get back to that life review, I don't want that same judgment.
Yeah.
I want it to be
a little better grade.
Yeah, maybe C+ this time. Well, at least you tried, maybe.
Listen, thanks for your soulful study. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So here's a question that I was struggling with. I mean, what really happens when we die? And it turns out that Stephen, Laura Lynn, I mean, there actually seems to be science behind this. The question is, what happens to our body? What happens to our brains? What exactly is death? So let me show you with this animation what modern science, what medicine thinks happens as we become closer and closer to death. So let's say we look inside of the body, and you've collapsed, and your heart's still beating, but the breathing's becoming more shallow. As you get shallower and shallower, all of a sudden your heart, which is struggling to eject that last little blood, all of a sudden it goes from being to a flat line. And now oxygen's no longer being delivered to tissues. Let's go inside the brain to see what's happening. Now that the heart's not pumping, the oxygen, these little bubbles coming out of the blood vessels, and your breathing is stopped too, so all of a sudden that stops. The red cells turn bluish, and the cells, the neurons of the brain, they begin to die. But you know what? As they suffocate, stop it. They don't all suffocate at the same time. This is vitally important. This is what we think happens when you leave your body during a near-death experience. Because it turns out that some parts of the brain where we actually sense these things have a better blood supply. So the sides of the brain, that's where we hear. The back of the brain, that's where we can see. That's all preserved. That's still pink. The areas that die first are the connections between these sensory areas. See these dark areas here? The glue that puts together what we see with what we hear with where we think we are. And when those areas, that glue, those cables snap or get suffocated, then we have these sort of out-of-body experiences where we leave where we are. And we have these weird senses floating around. So now let's move the animation forward. If you continue on the path without breathing, without blood, the rest of the brain turns black, and this is true death. Now you're really gone. So now that you understand what we think is happening during a near-death experience, I want you to meet someone who's studying how science and spirituality come together. Dr. Sam Parnia is one of the world's leading experts on what happens when we die, and he's trying to find scientific proof if near-death experiences really do happen.